Merry Christmas! Hope everyone's enjoying the incarnation or the celebration of the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. So we are going to have a short worship service in a sense because our sermon today is from Dr. Dan Rogers. It's 1 hour, so we're going to skip the music and the songs today because after all, we've already sang a lot of Christmas songs or carols last week. So, and you've been singing the music, the Christmas songs throughout the last 4 weeks or so. Anyway, we're going to show you also some videos and pictures of the houses and the neighborhood that we visited tonight after our dinner, and we just want to share that with you, just to share the joy that we experienced today. All right, so with that, again, Merry Christmas.
Have a joyful and blessed Christmas to everyone.
Yes, and enjoy the sermon today. After our dinner today, we decided to visit this Disney house that's located in Antioch. I saw this article in the news and I found it interesting that this house have painted their own decorations of Disney characters, and their decorations and lights grew through the years. They kept adding one item at a time, and now it's a beautiful destination for the neighborhood. And I think that's the owner of the house, and she's very proud. I guess they are all Disney fans, so we had fun visiting and enjoying the sceneries and the designs. And then we went to our neighborhood, and it's called the Tunnels of Joy. It's in Brentwood. It's a block away from our house, and as I've shown before, we have these tunnels and decorations in front of the houses, and almost everybody participated. And they have their own themes and designs, and a lot of kids enjoy walking through the tunnels and enjoying the displays. It was cold, but not too cold tonight. The highlight is this giant Santa Claus. It's a nice touch in the neighborhood, and we had fun. Again, Merry Christmas.
Those who know me know that planning is one of my love languages. I love the feeling when a perfectly laid plan comes together. And my love tank is filled when someone considers what I like when planning a night out. But life experience has taught me that plan A is not always guaranteed to turn out. This might remind you of the common saying, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. This saying was adapted from the poem To a Mouse, written in 1785 by the Scottish poet Robert Burns. In the poem, Burns apologizes to a mouse whose nest was destroyed when Burns plowed the field the nest was in. The poem makes the point that regardless of how well human beings plan, those plans can be overturned in an instant. We often base our plans on expectations we have for how things are usually done. If we're planning a trip, we expect the airline to leave at the specified time, and when it doesn't, our plans are upended. We're left unsettled and sometimes frustrated. In ancient times, the Jewish people expected God to provide a Messiah who would deliver them from their Assyrian oppressors and usher in a time of peace and plenty. They yearned for the deliverance and had expectations for the way that deliverance would take shape. The prophet Isaiah spoke to their concerns and assured them that God saw their suffering. But the scripture verses from Isaiah 9 talk about a Messiah who would be much more than they expected or planned for. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Isaiah's audience expected a political and military leader to rescue them, but the prophecy pointed to more than just a military leader or to Israel's rescue. It pointed to the Messiah and the rescue for all of humanity. The Israelites didn't know this, neither did the Jews in Jesus' day. They had plans for their rescuer, their Messiah, but God had different, bigger plans. In similar ways, we make plans and expect God to operate in our lives in a particular way, and sometimes nothing turns out. When our plans are upended and our expectations overturned, we can often feel unanchored or adrift. How can we trust that things will be okay? Isaiah's prophecy helps us remember that God plays a long game. He has a bigger plan, and our sign for that plan is Jesus. Consider all the ways that Jesus' birth, life, and death overturned human expectations. Here are a few. People expected the Son of God to be born in royal conditions. Jesus was born to a poor Jewish couple in a barn. People expected the Son of God to behave according to the cultural norms of the time. Jesus often defied cultural norms, choosing to eat with tax collectors and women and healing those considered unclean. People expected the Son of God to be above suffering. Jesus experienced suffering and grief to the point of death on a cross. The best laid plans we have will never be better than God's plans. And though we don't understand all of life's twists and turns, we can trust that a child has been born for us, and the Prince of Peace will always be by our side. As we celebrate his birth, may all who live in deep darkness see the great light of Jesus, and may your best laid plans always be trumped by the love of God. I'm Michelle Fleming, speaking of life.
Now, we've all heard the story about the birth of Jesus, right? Everybody's heard that story? How Joseph and Mary, his parents, were living in a small town of Nazareth in the region of Galilee. And all of a sudden they heard from Augustus Caesar that a census was going to be taken. And so they had to rush off to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem in Judea. And it was complicated, though, by the fact that Mary was 9 months pregnant. So Joseph put his 9-month pregnant wife on a donkey and started the journey all the way from Nazareth uphill all the way to Bethlehem in Judea. Now, when they got there, Mary was about to give birth. So they had to find a room in an inn. But when they tried an inn, they found out there was no room for them in the inn. It was booked up. It was full. So the innkeeper said, "You can go stay in the stable."
Nah, don't you worry. I got plenty of rooms at my inn, all with brand new carpeting. I think my water just broke. You can have the barn. Now feel free to come by the main house for breakfast. There won't be any.
So Joseph took his wife about to give birth into a stable where in the midst of all the animals in the stable, her baby Jesus was born, and she laid him in a manger, an animal feeding trough. And as she did this, suddenly a host of angels appeared and began singing praises to the newborn king. And shepherds showed up, and 3 wise men came with gifts. And they all there in front of the animals all stopped and praised and worshiped the King of the Jews. Only one little problem with that story. Most of it is wrong. That's what we call today fake news. Now, a lot of people have indiscriminately accepted traditions and stories and fanciful creations that are not biblical. So, what we're going to do today is take a look at the biblical account from the book of Luke and find out what Luke tells us from his perspective and from his research and his interviewing of hopefully eyewitnesses, what actually happened in this story. And then we're going to seek to understand not only what Luke tells us about the birth of Jesus, but what that story means for us today. So let's go to Luke chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 20. Luke chapter 2, and beginning in verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. All right, let's try to unpack that sentence just a little bit. In those days, what days were those? Well, the days of Caesar Augustus. Well, Caesar Augustus reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD. So those are the days of Caesar Augustus. You got that? 27 BC to 14 AD. Now, during that time, he issued a decree or a dogma, literally in the Greek, that a census, now census is from the Latin, registration would be the Greek term. So he decreed that a registration should be taken of the entire Roman world. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? Okay, few little difficulties. First of all, there's no historical record of any census given by Caesar Augustus for the entire Roman world. Okay. Was there any census? Yes, at least 3 are mentioned in historical records: 8 BC, 2 BC, and 6 AD. They were all in isolated regions of the Roman Empire, and the one in 6 AD was in Judea. So what's Luke telling us? Well, let's hold that for a moment, think about it, ponder it, and move on. Verse 2. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay, when was he governor of Syria? He began to be governor, according to Josephus, in 6 AD. Okay, wait a minute. We're beginning to run into some problems here. If you read the birth account in Matthew, Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod the Great died, according to Josephus, in 4 BC. That doesn't add up. How do you fit that in? When was Jesus born? Here, what is my answer, church? How do I answer these complex questions? You know my standard answer? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. All right, so we've got some dating problems here. Now, first of all, who made Josephus inspired and inerrant? Do we trust Luke or Josephus? Well, maybe we don't fully understand either one of them. So we're in a quandary there. How do you put all of this together? Well, it's very difficult. For example, The word translated first, the first census. What do you mean the first census? Well, the Greek word there is prote. Could it mean before? Possibly. Could it mean the most prominent? Possibly. Could it mean the first? Possibly. What we're going to find is that there are some things that we cannot say dogmatically about the birth of Jesus. We have to look at what Luke, and a little bit next week we're going to talk about Matthew, what they say, and we really can't go very far beyond what they explicitly say to know for sure. Everything else we have to speculate. We have to try to analyze and discern maybe what was going on. Now, you say, well, Pastor Dan, that's all very confusing. And I agree, it really is. All right, so here's my suggestion for you. If you want to know more, I suggest you read material by Dr. Darrell Bock, who is a theologian, been affiliated with Dallas Theological Seminary, but Darrell Bock, B-O-C-K, he presents a very scholarly, conservative understanding of this material and shows how we might be able to harmonize a bit what Luke says with what Josephus says and what history tells us. And he takes a very, very logical, very appropriate scholarly view of it. And it is conservative. So he tends to support Luke, but reasonably. If you want to know more from a critical perspective, I suggest you read Raymond Brown's The Birth of the Messiah. It's 2 volumes, and it's about yay thick. So it only takes Raymond Brown that much paper to describe what Luke has here in a few verses, which kind of gives you an indication of there's a lot going on here. And he takes a more critical approach, I'd say, than Darrell Bock. So if you want to do more reading, be my guest. I recommend those sources to you. Now, verse 3 we read, and everyone went to their own town to register. Why? Luke doesn't explain it. Does history tell us? No. Did that ever happen as far as we know in history? No. But Luke says it did. Okay. Accept the fact that it did. Why? We don't know. Was it an oath of loyalty? Perhaps, some people say, well, it was for taxation. Are you sure? How do we know that? Maybe it was just an oath of loyalty. Maybe because Joseph was of the line of David and maybe had a kingly claim that he needed to take a loyalty oath back in the city of David. Maybe. There's just a lot of maybes going on here. But what's the point? Why does Luke even bother mentioning this? Aha, now we're getting somewhere. What's Luke's point? Luke's point is that Jesus was born in the midst of the world, in the midst of Caesar, in the midst of the Roman Empire, in the midst of Caesars, kings, governors, all that was going on, all the politics. And Jesus was born. And nobody cared. Nobody paid attention. Born and placed in an animal feeding trough. And the world largely ignored Jesus and his birth. So that's Luke's point. That's what he's saying is going on here. Okay, we move on to verse 4. So Joseph went up. Okay, if you know anything about geography, you know that Nazareth in Galilee is to the north, and that Bethlehem is just to the south of Jerusalem, about 90 miles, depending on the route you take, 70 to 90 miles south. So why do you go up? You always go up to Jerusalem. Always. Every scripture you go up, it's uphill. So they went up from the town of Nazareth and Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David. All right, now, how did they go? Well, first of all, as I said, it's about 70 miles direct. But you don't want to go direct because that would take you through Samaria. And Jews were not welcome in Samaria. And so typically you would go around Samaria over to the Transjordan, down the east side of the Jordan River, cross back over, enter the town of Jericho, and then from Jericho go uphill all the way to Jerusalem.
Are we there yet?
No!
Are we there yet?
No, we are not.
Are we there yet?
No!
But this is taking forever, Shrek, and ain't no in-flight movie or nothing.
That's probably the way that Joseph and Mary went, and that's a distance of approximately 90 miles. How long did that take them? Well, if they walked really fast, 3 days. If they walked at a more normal rate, about 4 days. If they took a donkey, about a week or two. There's no donkey. People generally did not travel with donkeys unless there was a caravan carrying lots of goods. People generally did not ride on a donkey. There's no donkey in the story. From Luke's perspective, most likely Joseph and Mary walked. Did they walk alone? I doubt it. They probably walked with other people who perhaps had to register as well. We don't know. Luke doesn't. Oh, Luke, as I've said before, someday we're going to meet Luke in heaven. I got a list of questions for him. But at any rate, Joseph and Mary probably walked the distance. Where did they stay along the way? Don't know. Did they have reservations? I don't think so. They walked, they camped out, whatever they did. How did Mary do that 9 months pregnant? I'm going to suggest she wasn't. Okay, bear with me on that. So they went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David. Now, what's important here for Luke is none of the things I've just mentioned. What's important for Luke is the town of David. Why? What Luke wants his audience to see is that Jesus was legally the son of Joseph. Joseph was the ancestor of King David. Therefore, it was out of the line of David that the Messiah would come, the true King of the Jews who would sit on the throne of his father David forever. Who could that be? Duh, it's Jesus. And that's what Luke wants his audience to get out of this. So it's very important for Luke to get Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, the birthplace, the home of David, and have Jesus be born there. That's Luke's point. Now, he also explains that Bethlehem is the town of David because Luke's primary audience was Gentile Christians. They would not have known, perhaps, that Bethlehem was the house of David. So Luke explains it to them, and then they can get his point. So, to the town of David, because Joseph belonged to the house, Matthew 2:11 explains that, and the line, the patria, the line of David, the kingly line, the line that was to produce eventually the Messiah, the anointed, the Christ. Verse 5. He went there to register with Mary. Okay, what is that? Does that mean that Mary had to go too? Did Joseph not want to leave her behind? Why would he not want to leave her behind? Well, one, why not take your betrothed with you? Two, she was pregnant. And they had not come together yet as husband and wife. And the relatives back in Nazareth, maybe the neighbors, knew that. What if Mary started showing and looked pregnant? People would talk. Maybe he took Mary with him to avoid her having to go through that kind of a situation? Don't know. Was Mary descended from David so that she had to go to Bethlehem and register? Maybe. Don't know. What do we know? Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem. Okay. So he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged, betrothed, and for all practical purposes, we would say today, his wife, though they had not come together. Perhaps they had not had a wedding ceremony, but in the customs of the Jews of that day, a betrothal was an official, legal, what we would call marriage, even though perhaps the wedding ceremony had not yet taken place. Or maybe it had. We don't know for sure. But Luke does use the word that means pledged or betrothed. So Mary, who was betrothed to be married to him and was expecting a child. Now, I love that. That's almost following the King James, because guess what the Greek word there is? Pregnant. But that's not a real pretty word. So expecting a child. Oh, she was pregnant. So she was pledged to him and she was pregnant. Oh, wait, how far along was she? Doesn't say. Well, we can surmise that she was at least more than 3 months. How do we know that? Well, if you might remember, she went to visit her relative Elizabeth and stayed there 3 months after she found out she was going to be pregnant with the Son of God. So she's more than 3 months likely, but 9 months? I doubt that. Why would a man take a 9-month pregnant woman on a 90-mile hike? That doesn't seem to make sense. I very seriously doubt she was much over 3 months along. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. While they were there. Where? Bethlehem. While they were there. How long a while were they there? Luke doesn't say. Okay, well, let's surmise that, let's say Mary was more than 3 months along when they left. And we're waiting till she gives birth. That would be 9 months. 6 months? Were they there 6 months? Don't know. But I suggest it was not, they arrived one night and she gave birth. I don't think that happened at all. Somewhere around 6 months or a little less, they were there in Bethlehem before Mary gave birth. So while they were there, okay, now I got another question for you. Don't you love the way you just have to ask questions all the time? You go and you just stop. Wait a minute. Where were they? Well, they're in Bethlehem. Where in Bethlehem? Don't know. They were somewhere in Bethlehem for what appears to be several months. Then there came the day, or the time, literally the days. I love this, came for the baby to be born. The little Greek is to produce a baby. The time, the days came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. Protokos, firstborn. What does firstborn mean? Duh, born first. Yeah. Does it mean she had more children? Not necessarily. This was just her firstborn. But in Jewish culture, it means more. In fact, the child that was born first in the Jewish tradition was not always the firstborn. If you don't believe that, go back and read the story about Reuben, who was the firstborn of Israel, but lost the right to be firstborn. And the firstborn right eventually went to one who was near the end of the stream of children, Joseph. So firstborn was also a title. It was the inheritor. It's the one who received the biggest inheritance, according to Jew. And that could be passed down. It did not have to literally be the one born first. Now, what we have here with Jesus is he was the one born first. First time she had a child, and it was Jesus, but he's also the inheritor of what? His father, at least legal father, Joseph's inheritance, which is what? The line of David the king. So she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. I'm going to stop right there. She, okay. Was Mary alone? Well, Joseph was with her. Didn't he do anything to help? Didn't he go to birthing classes or something to help out here? Is she alone? Typically, in that day, there would have been a midwife present. Relatives would have come and helped out. Were they there? Don't know. Luke, come on, man. Give us a little bit more, would you please? But the important thing for Luke is what? Mary does this. What does she do? She swaddles. That's the Greek term, swaddle. We have it in English too. And what does it mean? To wrap a baby in cloths. Why? To keep it warm, to keep it secure, to make it feel wanted and snuggled. In other words, it's Mary took excellent care of this baby. That's what Luke wants us to understand. Jesus was born and to excellent care, concern, and love. So, and you know what's interesting here? We're going to see that she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. Do you know what the most important thing in this entire story appears to be for Luke? And the main thing that he wants his audience to get? That Jesus was wrapped in cloths and placed in a manger. We'd say, I didn't see that coming. I thought it was this. I thought it was that. Well, if you read the story carefully, for Luke, he says this is what you need to focus on. He was wrapped in cloths and laid in probably a stone, it could have been wooden, but a stone place of rest. What could Luke be hinting that we should see in that? When Jesus died, his body was wrapped in linen cloths, and he was placed in a stone area where he was laid. This seems to be the most important thing for Luke, for his audience to get. Is he hinting at something there? I would say it looks that way. So they placed him in a manger. What's a manger? A fatne in the Greek. Now, manger comes into English from Latin, from the word that means to eat. If you speak French, manger, to eat. So it's a manger. So what's a manger for? To eat. We'd call it a feeding trough, a feeding place. It could be translated a stall, but it also could be translated a crib. Crib, what do you mean a crib? Well, a crib is where you put animals. A crib's also where you put babies. At least that's the way it is in English, is it not? That's a crib. Get it? But it's a manger. It's a feeding trough. Why is that important for Luke? What could Luke be trying to signal his readers here? What could we pick up on today? Is there some little inside joke, you might say, that Luke wants us to get? Okay, what's the name of the place Jesus is born? Bethlehem. Anybody know what Bethlehem from the Aramaic means translated into English? House of bread. House of bread. And Jesus is the bread of life. And so where do you put in the house of bread, the bread of life? Why not put it in a feeding place? To be fed upon. What a coincidence how all that worked out. All right. So laid him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. So the NIV translators here have done away with the inn and has become a guest room. You know why? Because that's what it was. Now, in the King James versions and others, it's translated in. The Greek word kataluma could be translated in, but generally is not. In fact, if you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, when he took the man and he put him up in an inn, Luke uses the standard word for inn. So Luke knows the standard Greek term for inn. He uses the standard Greek term for inn. How does Luke use kataluma? Well, when the disciples wanted to have the Last Supper together, celebrate the Passover meal, Luke says they went and they rented a kataluma, translated the upper room, a rented room. So for Luke, clearly, what does kataluma mean? And what is its primary Greek meaning? A rented room, a lodging place, a place where guests would go. Thus, no guest room available. This was mostly, can I say absolutely? Can I say 100%? Can I say categorically? No, I can't. However, I'm reasonably certain this was not an inn. And he was not in a stable. There was no room, no guest room available for them. Now, where did they go? You say, well, they went to an inn. Well, yeah, but they forgot to make reservations. No, where would you go? Well, where did Mary go 3 months ago? When she found out she was going to give birth to the Son of God, she went and stayed with some relatives who lived near Bethlehem. Likely Joseph and or Mary had relatives in Bethlehem. This would be where you would go, the custom of the day. Inns, not the best place to go, get kind of rowdy. You go to a relative's home. This was likely the home of either David and or Mary's relatives, and they went. But when they got there, the guest room was unavailable. And in fact, the Greek says there was no place, topos, or room, space. There was no space for them in the guest room. Why is that? Well, maybe by this time, Mary's pregnant and about to give birth. She's been there a long time, but now she's about to give birth, and the relatives go, there's no way this woman's giving birth in our little guest room. There's just no space in there for her with her husband, a midwife, and maybe other women in there to help out. We're going to have to put her on the main floor. So likely she was on the main floor of their house because the guest room was too small. Or maybe it was occupied. Now, on the main room of a typical home, either one story or two story, let's say it's one story, the first floor was elevated. There was a part where the dining room and the eating area was, and there was a lower area in front of that where often people would bring an animal or so in. Why? Because you didn't want people stealing your animals. You wanted to safeguard them. And you say, are you telling me that people had animals in their house? Yeah, I do. And guess what? I even have a feeding trough there for the animal in my house. Yeah. So that's not unusual. That's not uncommon. But what we see here is a feeding trough, a manger, probably on the first floor of a relative's home, because the guest room was either occupied or not big enough for a woman who's about to give birth and those who might attend her. Where are the animals? There are no animals mentioned in Matthew or Luke. No animals present, according to them, at the birth of Jesus. Where did the animals come from? Well, some say there's a hidden reference in the book of Isaiah. I think mostly they came from people's imagination. Because if you got a manger, you got to have an animal. Not so. Are you going to put your newborn baby in a trough that an animal just fed out of? I don't think so. Luke makes the point that Jesus was exceptionally well cared for. I don't think he was put into some dirty animal feeding trough. In fact, I don't think there were any animals there. There was just a clean trough with fresh hay, perhaps. No animals around. You got a pregnant lady in the house, she's going to give birth. Get the animals out of here and clean up. And so that's where Mary gave birth to Jesus and placed him in a manger. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. All right, let's think about that. Now, you may have heard it said that, Jesus could not have been born in December. Why? Well, because the shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks in the fields at night, and they didn't do that in the winter because it was cold. Fake news. Myth. Not true. Many historical records show that shepherds kept their sheep out in the fields year-round. Not uncommon to have them out in December. Not true. So there were shepherds, plural, living out in the fields. The Greek would imply spending the night out in open country. Why did they have their sheep out in open country? Well, evidently that was not unusual for shepherds to do. If this registration was about taxation, and you got taxed on how many sheep you had, you might want to take them out in the woods somewhere and hide them. So, we don't have to pay tax on these sheep. Nobody's going to find them out here. Or they could have been out there. They were just a few miles from the temple in Jerusalem. They could have been getting them ready for the influx of visitors who might have needed extra sacrificial lambs or whatever. We don't know. But at any rate, it could have been winter. Don't know that it was. Could have been. And what we do know that multiple shepherds, now which indicates what was the size of this flock. It was a good sized flock to have multiple shepherds, and they were out spending the night in the open country, and they were guarding, keeping watch over, now listen to this, their flock. It's not plural in the Greek. Their flock. Their flock. Does that mean the shepherds owned this flock? Does it mean that this flock was in their care? It would hint to the fact that the flock belonged to the shepherds. If so, were these shepherds, like you usually hear, poor shepherds, marginalized people, untrusted, the down dredges of humanity shepherds? Maybe, maybe not. Seems like David was a shepherd. Pretty good guy. Jesus was the good shepherd of the line of David, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. Shepherds, David, Jesus, Bethlehem. Kind of all makes sense. The Bible speaks of good shepherds and bad shepherds. Don't paint all shepherds with the same brush. Were they poor shepherds? Not if they owned this flock, they weren't. And they turned out to be what? Really good guys. Very worshipful. Very fascinated. The king of the Jews. Wow, let's go. The shepherds sometimes, I think, get discriminated against in this story. There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord. Angel means a messenger, an angel of the Lord appeared. Actually, the literal Greek is stood by. Because how do we typically picture angels? Thank you, medieval painters. They're floating overhead with their wings flapping, right? This angel was standing there. A lot of the times we've got angels in the Bible, they're just standing around. They're not flying overhead, they're just standing there. They look like human males, generally, as they're pictured. An angel of the Lord stood by them, and the glory, the doxa Greek, splendor, brilliance. Doxa is generally used of the perceptible presence of God. In other words, you can't see God, but you see this brightness. The Jews eventually began to call this the Shekinah glory, the shining, brilliant presence of God. The burning bush example. The light shows God is present here, though you can't see God. So an angel of the Lord stood by, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. I love the Greek. They were feared with great fear. I like that. They were terrified. Okay, verses 10 through 14. Luke gives the theological meaning of the story. Here comes the theological meaning of the story, verses 10 through 14. You know how we tend to focus in our modern culture on the birth? Mary gave birth and there was a baby. That's not Luke's focus at all. He mentions it, of course, but that's not his focus. Here's his theology, verse 10. But the angel said to them, and in the Greek he said, I do gar. Have you heard that word I-D-O-U enough? Do you know what it means? Anybody remember? Behold. Look. Behold. Look. Gar means for. Behold, for. Do not be afraid. I bring you good news. Good news. What's the Greek word for good news? Evangelidzomai. That's from what we get the word evangelism, evangelize. What does it mean? What do we call in Old English the good news? What Old English term do we usually put on that expression? It's the gospel. Isn't that interesting? That's what's said here. Do not be afraid, I bring you the gospel. The good news that will cause great joy. And throughout Luke Acts, this is a response to God's presence and the preaching of the gospel. Joy. And here in this are a whole bunch of words that Luke loves. There's certain words that Luke uses over and over again in the gospel, the book of Acts, and almost all of them are found in what the angels say. So either Luke wrote the angel's speech for them, was their ghostwriter, you might say, or Luke got it from what he heard, researched, and found out that the angels had said. But Luke loves these words. Good news that will cause great joy for all the people. And here the word is laos, Laos, which Luke uses for the people of God, in particular Israel. Today, verse 11, Cimarron. We've run across that word before. Today. How does Luke use today? Cimarron. Luke tends to use this in what we might call an eschatological frame of reference. For Luke, today means this is the special day in which God's purpose, plan, message, purpose is being revealed. Remember what Jesus said to the thief on the cross? When would the thief be with him in paradise? Today. 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 In the town of David. Important for Luke, wants his readers to get, Bethlehem. The town of David, a Savior. Translate that to Greek. So translate it back to Hebrew Aramaic, and you get Yeshua. Jesus. Savior. The town of David, a Savior, Jesus, has been born. He's been born to you, you shepherds, all the people of God, all Israel. He is the Messiah, Hebrew for anointed. What's the Greek word? Christos, the Christ. He is the Christ, the Lord, the Kyrios, the Lord. Look at all those words he packs in there. Gospel, joy, today, Savior, Messiah, Lord. You get the theological message that Luke wants his audience to get from what the angels say? This is who just got born. Do you understand the significance of the birth? This is the significance of the birth. Verse 12. This will be a sign to you. Now listen to this. What's going to be the sign? What's going to be the sign? The sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. I told you that was Luke's focus. Luke said, here's the sign. Get this message. A baby wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. And the shepherds are like, what? Wrapped in cloths? That's real nice. Lying in a manger? Are you kidding me? Who puts their baby in a manger? Boy, if we find a baby in a manger, we know that what the angel said must be true. Hello? Yes. It is the sign. Suddenly. What's the importance of that? Suddenly, unexpectedly. In Malachi, suddenly the Lord shall come to his temple. Suddenly, according to Luke, the Spirit came on Pentecost. Suddenly, according to Luke, Jesus appeared to Saul, the Apostle Paul, on the road to Damascus. Suddenly, you'll see the sign of the Son of Man coming in the heavens. Suddenly, all these events come suddenly. Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly host, and the word literally means army. The heavenly army appeared with the angel praising God and saying. Were the angels there with Mary at the birth of... No. The angels appeared to the shepherds out in the field. This was the angel's message to the shepherds. And here are the angels coming from where? Heaven. Where are the shepherds out in the field on the earth? Did you catch Luke's imagery here? There's a coming together of heaven and earth. What in the world would bring heaven and earth together? Jesus. In Jesus, heaven and earth come together. So they appeared with an angel, praising God, saying, glory, doxa, to God in the highest heaven or the highest places. And here we have, what we read in chapter 19, verse 38, a mirror of that. This is what is called a doxology. Ever heard the word doxology? Doxa, glory, praise. Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth, peace to those on whom his favor rests. Real peace. Now, there's a play here, too, on Augustus Caesar. Remember Luke started with Augustus Caesar? Intentionally. Great writer. Great use of resources. There was an inscription on a monument to Augustus Caesar that all was spread throughout the Roman Empire, fairly well known. You know what it said? On this, the birthday of the god, meaning Augustus Caesar, on this, the birthday of the god, it is the beginning of good news for all the world. Hello, excuse me? Oh, yeah? These angels are mocking that inscription. It ain't Caesar. On this birthday of the God who truly brings good news to all the world. Verse 15. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, withdrawn into heaven, that reminds you of Jesus and the ascension. They watched them, you might say, go. The shepherds said or kept saying to one another, let's go. The Greek word de, D-E, is a sense of urgency. Let's go. Let's go to Bethlehem. And let's see this thing. Let's see the thing and word, Rama, same word. Let's go see what's been said come to pass. Let's go see it. Let's go see the fulfillment of this word. Let's go to Bethlehem right now. Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about through his messengers, the angels. They were not instructed to do so. They were not commanded to do so. But they were told what they would find if they did. So they responded, and they did. These are good guys. They're very sincere. They want to go worship. Now, got a question. Here we go. Who took care of the sheep? All the shepherds get up and go to Bethlehem. What happens to the sheep? Luke, would you please sometimes give us just a little details of what's all going on here? Anyway, it shows their zeal, doesn't it? They're willing to leave their flock out in the field because this was more important. Let's go see this thing. So they hurried off, very excited. They hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. Now, the English doesn't convey it, but the Greek verb there conveys by looking around. They had to look around. Now, thankfully, Bethlehem was not very big, small village. All they had to do was go into town. Now, I'm going to guess that it was not night anymore, that it was morning. Just going to guess that. And they're asking around town, did you see some strangers from out of town at a woman who was 9 months pregnant and she's giving birth and you heard that maybe that the baby was in a manger or something? Did you hear that? And it didn't take too long in a small town because I bet this situation was known, and I wouldn't doubt that Mary didn't have women helping her with the birth, and so it wasn't as unlikely as it may seem for them to quickly find Joseph and Mary and the baby. And so they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in a manger. There it is. That's what the angel said. What's the sign? Lying in a manger, in a stone hewn out. He is resting. How fitting. When they had seen him, they spread or made known the word concerning what had been told them about this child. They spread the gospel. First evangelists. They spread the word. Christ is born. The good news. And all, verse 18, probably in Bethlehem, all in Bethlehem who heard it were amazed. One of Luke's favorite words. Surprised, marveled at, wondered at, were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. Better translation or fuller translation of the Greek would be preserved for later interpretation. All these things. Like, can you imagine Mary? It's difficult. What was in her mind? I get some of this, I think Mary is thinking, but what does it all mean? What's going to happen? Where is this going to go? That's my baby. Son of God? Emmanuel? God with us? Virgin birth? Where's this headed? How am I going to raise this child? What's he going to be like? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to be his mother? We might say Mary was the first Christian, but she certainly, like most Christians, did not understand everything right away. She had to think this thing over. She had to think this thing through. She had to figure it out as she went. And at times we find in this gospel story, she was puzzled and didn't know what to make of things. But she knew something special had happened to her, obviously. Now we might ask this question, where did Luke find out all this? Luke was probably a Gentile. Probably not from Judea. Lived at a little bit later time. How did he find out? A good guess would be he talked to Mary. He interviewed Mary and said, Mary, tell me what you remember. Tell me. Can I say that for sure? No. But you have to wonder, as Luke got his information from interviewing sources and from written records and so forth, he was not an eyewitness, but he told the story as well as he could. Verse 20, the shepherds returned glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. They saw the proof of their own eyes to everything that the angels said. So what did we learn today? Well, I hope we learned that a lot of the things we may have thought about the birth of Jesus were inaccurate. Can we know for sure the year, month, and day of Jesus' birth? No. Why? Well, look at it this way. No one knows the date of his coming either. You know, I know when Jesus was born. Yeah, well, I know when Jesus is coming again. Oh, yeah? I don't think so. No one does. The date of Jesus' birth was not of great importance to the writers of the New Testament. Only Matthew and Luke even mention it, and they say very little about it and leave out a lot. And leave us with more questions than we have answers. While ancestry was very important in the Jewish culture of the day of one's birth and the celebration of that day were not important. More important was the day you died than the day you were born. Was it on December 25th that Jesus was born? That's possible. I'd say even likely. That date was first suggested around 200 AD. based on the understanding. It started with understanding when Jesus died, because the death and resurrection of Jesus were widely celebrated by early Christians long before his birth. And they wanted to know when it was. They knew it was during the Passover. They tried to figure out the year, somewhere between 1 and 6 BC. And they finally settled on a date. Now, I'm not saying they were right. What I'm saying is they finally settled on a date of March 25th. March 25th was the day that Jesus was resurrected. And someone said, well, you know, our tradition is that great people, they were conceived on the same date on which they died. Okay, if Jesus died on March 25th, 9 months later is December 25th. That's when he was born. Not that anyone cares, but that's our tradition. And so the date of December 25th began to be popularized as the birthday of Jesus, though it was not a big issue. Now, why do I say it? Well, if you read fake news, well, they derive the date of December 25th from pagan ceremonies that emerged in the 3rd and 4th centuries. No. The original thinking about December 25th came from about 200, and it came by Christians who were Jewish Christians thinking possibly more about the date of his death and resurrection, but then extrapolating, if so, than the date of his birth. Now, I'm not saying they were right. What I'm saying was that's when the date emerged as a thought, as the birthday of Jesus. Not out of paganism, but out of Jewish tradition. Based on the writings of the early church fathers and a number of historical records, December 25th is a possibility, a good possibility. It took Christians a while to realize the importance of celebrating the birth of Jesus. There was a heresy that began to spread in the 2nd and 3rd centuries called Docetism. Docetism was a Gnostic Christian philosophy that Jesus only appeared. He wasn't real. He wasn't really human. He was like a ghost. It was just an illusion. It was just, he appeared to be here, but he really wasn't. That's called Docetism. It denied that God had come in the flesh. So by the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christians were saying, I think we really better celebrate the birth of Jesus and the incarnation. Because if we want to combat this heresy and make sure that Christians know that Jesus was born a human, lived a human, died a human, ascended to heaven as a human, then we better celebrate his birth and memorialize that. It's important. And thus, the Christian practice of celebrating the birth of Jesus became important, particularly in the face of the Docetic heresy of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So what did we learn? We've learned there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we can't say for sure. We've learned that there are some things that we've heard are wrong. But the main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. What Luke and Matthew explicitly say, we know, we can believe, we can understand. How do we sum it all up? Well, I'd like to sum it up today in the words of the prophet Isaiah, which Luke, in the words of the angels, alludes to. From the prophet Isaiah, for unto us a child has been born, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And that's what we learn from this story in Luke chapter 2 today. Let us all hail King Jesus. And Merry Christmas, and to all a good night.